Now,
the axial skeleton actually consists of the skull bones. It consists of the vertebra. It consists of the hyoid bone, the thoracic cage, and also your sternum. In your skull bones, you have actually two types of bones, the cranial bones and you have your facial bones. The cranial bones actually consist of the al bones, AL, and also the oid bones. The al bones actually are the following. You have the frontal bone, which is one bone. Then you got your parietal bone, two bones. Then you got your temporal bone, two bones. And then you got your occipital bone, one bone. Before I discuss the other cranial bones, I want to talk about the sutures. The sutures, actually, you have the coronal suture that actually separates your frontal and your parietal bone. Then you have your squamosal that actually separate your temporal and your parietal bone. Then you have your lambdoid suture that actually separates your occipital bone and your parietal bone. And then you have your sagittal suture that separates your two parietal bone. Then you got the oid bones, which is also your sphenoid. That's one sphenoid. It's more complicated. The oid is more complicated. And then you have your ethmoid bone on here, which is another complicated bone that I will talk about in a second. I want to talk about, at this time, I want to talk about your temporal bone, the important parts of the temporal bone. The temporal bone actually consists of the mandibular fossa. If you look at this one here, I will take out this mandible. That is your mandibular fossa, where the mandibular process actually is attached. Then you have your external auditory meatus, which is actually the passageway to your ear. And then you got your mastoid process that contains air cells or sinuses, that inside that there can be bacteria or viruses can attack can be in those sinuses and can cause mastoiditis. And then you have your styloid process in here, which is actually, it looks like a pencil. It's a sharp bone that looks like a pencil. And then you have your two foramen, important foramen. One, actually, that part there is your jugular foramen, and then the round one over there is actually your carotid foramen. Then you have your occipital bone. That one there is your occipital bone. The occipital bone consists of a big foramen, which is the foramen magnum, the biggest foramen in the skull, and that is where your spinal cord comes out, coming from your brain. And then you have your occipital condyle in here, that one there, which is actually a process which is on the side of your foramen magnum. And then you have your external occipital protuberance also, which you can feel at the back of your head and here. Then you have your sphenoid bone, which is actually more complicated. There are lots of parts of sphenoid bone, but for the sake of our lab, I will only show you the important part that is involved in our lab. This is your sphenoid bone in here. But if you really look at it in this model, all of this is a part of your sphenoid bone. And this area in here also is a part of your sphenoid bone. If you look at this one here, this is your sphenoid bone, that one there. And for the sake of our lab, there is a part of the sphenoid bone that we emphasize in our lab, and that is the sella turcica, or the hypophyseal fossa. And that is very important because that is where your pituitary gland sits. And it's the same thing here. That one there is your sella turcica, or hypophyseal fossa, where the pituitary gland sits. The next part that I want to make mention is your lacrimal bone. That is on the lateral side of your orbit, that one there. But if you look at this model in here also, that is your ethmoid bone, that one there. Ethmoid bone, that one there, and that is your ethmoid bone. Again, for the sake of our lab also, there's a part of the ethmoid bone that I really want to emphasize, and that is your crista galli, that one there. If you look at this one here, this is your ethmoid bone. That one there is your ethmoid bone. All of this is that part there. Okay, now, the crista galli, this one here, crista means comb, and galli means rooster, meaning the comb of the rooster. That is very, very important because that is where the dura mater of the meninges of your brain is actually attached. The next part actually that I want to make mention are the fossa in the inside your skull. This is your anterior fossa, that one there. That's your lateral fossa, and that is your posterior fossa, cranial fossa. The fossa is so important, and you need to realize that the inside of the skull is so important to understand, because that is where the brain actually, it encloses the brain. And if you look at this one here, it is so hostile inside this skull, inside the skull. And so you don't shake a baby, because the brain actually goes into this hostile environment of the skull, which can cause actually a baby shake syndrome. The next one that I want to make mention is your mandible. If you look at this one here, this is your mandible, that one there. This is your mandible also. Mandible is the only movable bone in the skull. The only movable bone in the skull. For your mandible, the most important part is your mandibular condyle, that one there. Don't forget that the mandibular condyle is attached, is our articulate to the mandibular fossa, that one there, the mandibular fossa. So this condyle is actually articulate in your mandibular fossa. If you look at that one in here, that goes that way in this bone. Okay, here's your fossa. Now, one thing I want you to understand with the mandible, actually, this is your mandibular foramen, that one there. The mandibular foramen actually is that foramen where your trigeminal nerve actually passes through, and that is where The dentist actually put his needle when he is working at your premolar and molar of your teeth. There's another one that I want to make mention. This one here is your mental foramen. Your trigeminal nerve goes through your mental foramen in here, and that's where the dentist put also his needle when he is working on the front tooth of your lower jaw also. Another thing that I want to make mention is the alveoli in here. The alveoli is where the teeth goes through, is inserted. Okay, the alveoli is like the socket. And in your chapter 9, chapter 8, that kind of articulation is known as a gum process also. Then you got your maxilla. This is your maxilla also. And the maxilla is actually the upper jaw. Then you got your zygomatic bone in here. Then you got your nasal bone. Then you got your lacrimal bone, that one there, where the tears actually comes out. You got your lacrimal foramen there. And then you got your palatine bone, that one there. That's your palatine bone. Then you got your vomer. The vomer actually is this one here that goes out here, a part of the nasal septum. You will notice that the vomer and the perpendicular plate actually of your ethmoid bone makes up your nasal septum. So the perpendicular plate of your ethmoid bone and your vomer makes up your nasal septum. Then you got your hyoid bone in here. This is your hyoid bone, that one there. I want to mention that in your axial skeleton, in your skull bone, there are 5 bones that has sinuses. One actually is your frontal, has a sinus. Then you got your ethmoid here, has also a sinus. Then you got your mastoid bone, has sinuses. The maxilla has sinuses also. And your sphenoid bone has also sinuses. Then I want to talk about your vertebra. When you talk about the vertebra, there are 4 important parts of the vertebra. The body, which is always ventral. Then you got your spinous process, which is always dorsal. Then you have your transverse process, that one there. And then you have your vertebral canal, where your spinal cord passes through. And then you have the next bone. This bone also, I want to make mention that this is your lumbar vertebra. The reason why this is lumbar vertebra, because if you look at this one here, big body, and your spinous process is pointing forward. You will notice if it is a thoracic vertebra, this one here is actually a thoracic. It is the upper thoracic vertebra. You'll notice that normally a thoracic vertebra, the spinous process is pointing down. But since this is the upper, it's still pointing forward. Okay. Now, this is your superior articular facet, this one here. And you have that one in your lobe. And then, of course, at the back here is your inferior articular facet. Then you have your, I want you to take note, this is your sacrum. The sacrum is 5 bones, actually 5 vertebrae fused in one. I want to make mention, since this is not a real bone, inside here is actually a canal. You call that one sacral canal. And that sacral canal opens up in this area here, that one there, the sacral hiatus, where the doctor usually put also the do the epidural injections when you have epidural. Then you have your coccyx, which has 3 to 4 bones. Many people calls it the tailbone. One of the things that I want you to take note is your cervical vertebra. The first cervical vertebra is actually the atlas. One thing I want you to take note with cervical vertebra is that they always have a transverse foramen, that one there. All cervical vertebra has a transverse foramen. This is your first cervical vertebra, which is actually your atlas. There is no body, no spinous process. What you have actually is your facet for the occipital condyle. That's very, very important. And the arch also in here. Okay, the facet for the occipital condyle, that is where the occipital bone, the occipital condyle actually sits like that. And it enable your head actually to say yes, like that. Yes, flexion and extension. The second cervical vertebra is your axis. Axis has a dents in here. The dents actually serves as a pivot so that your head can say no, like this, like that. And all the 5 cervical vertebrae, this is still cervical because it has a transverse foramen, they are considered to be 5 typical vertebrae. To make a summary, the cervical vertebra, there are 7 cervical vertebrae. What time do you have breakfast in the morning? And that will be 7. There are 7 cervical vertebrae. There are also 12 thoracic vertebrae. And those, what time will you have to remember that? What time will you have lunch at noon? And that will be 12 o'clock. Then there are 5 lumbar vertebrae, which is when you can say, what time will you have dinner in the evening? And that will be 5 o'clock. And then there are also 5 sacral vertebrae fused in one. What time do you wake up by yourself in the morning? And that will be 5 o'clock. And 3 to 4 actually coccygeal. What time will you have brunch in the afternoon? And that is 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This is your ribs, which is a part of your thoracic cage. And then this is your sternum. Only this part, but that looks like a dagger, is your sternum. Okay, you got 3 parts of your sternum. The manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. This is not a part of the sternum. This is your costal cartilage. Don't forget that your sternum is the last bone, one of the last bone that will be ossified, especially at age 25, especially your xiphoid process. In this costal cartilage in here, the ribs are attached here. You have the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The ribs that are attached here are considered to be true ribs because it is directly attached to the sternum. And then you have your 8, 9, and 10. They're considered to be false rib because they are attached to the 7th costal cartilage. And there are 2 more ribs, which is actually your floating 4 more or 2 pairs floating ribs, which is not attached to any of this. They are just attached to the muscles, okay, and they are considered to be floating ribs. That's it.